this. Okay, so the recording has started. Hello, Temple. Thank you for joining the Wellness Resource Center and the Institute on Disabilities to honor Cervical Health Awareness Month. My name is Allison Beaumont. I am the Peer Education and Sexual Health Program Assistant at the Wellness Resource Center. And then today we have Izzy Kaufman with us here to help us dive into this discussion on how students can be supported and advocate for their care in health settings. Izzy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I can introduce myself. It's always like different every time I do it. Um, but I'm Izzy. I'm a disability advocate. I am disabled myself. My title at the IOD is Assistive Technology Program Coordinator, but I'm more of a sexuality educator researcher now. So it's kind of like morphed. But yeah, what else did I want to say? My pronouns are she and they. Um, and I live in Philly, and I heard some fireworks and stuff last night when I was about to go to bed because of all the Eagles winning. So just celebrating that. But I love sexuality education, so I'm happy to get into it.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me today. The Eagle celebration was super great. Very,
Yeah,
very exciting. Well, thanks again for being here today to talk about this important month and how we can support students with disabilities when it comes to sexual health. I also love sexual health. So we're going to dive into the questions. One, let's start by talking a bit about the Institute on Disabilities and how you all serve Temple students. And then can you tell us more about what you do there?
absolutely. So the Institute on Disabilities is kind of like the umbrella, but we're an office on campus. We're a nonprofit as a part of a larger network of university centers. Um, I'm not going to say like all the acronyms, but we have different categories of services and programs and things. But what we do is we actually serve outward from the Temple community more than we serve like students directly. Like we have a leadership and career studies program, which is for students who have developmental disabilities to come and have campus life and get a degree. Um, I didn't want to forget about that. But then really we have like lots of students who come and do internships with us. So we have a lot of internship students with us all the time working in our office. But we really work outside the Temple community a lot. We host the assistive technology program, which is called Tech Owl. And anyone can take advantage of Tech Owl if you're from PA or if you live in PA, which you are because you're a student here in Temple. You would be able to take advantage of some of our resources. We have a lending library. I'm not going to go into it too far, but you can look at the Tech Owl website and learn a lot more. And then I wanted to just highlight, in partnership with Tech Owl, we're doing a really fun Valentine's Day crafting event slash sexuality education event. Um, and it's going to be February 10th at 2 p.m. At the community center for Tech Owl. So come check that out. We'll have like a link to it.
That sounds super
And
exciting.
I'm trying to think. Okay. And then the Healthy Sexuality Project. I could talk like the IOD is so big. We have so many different programs. I would just recommend any students who's interested in learning to go on our website and look at all the programs. But I, of course, work on the Healthy Sexuality Project, and that's really the program that like I'm jazzed about. Um, I work with Nova, who's our another one of our sexuality educators, and we do a lot of presentations for people with disabilities, professionals in that sphere. We also have a library of sorts. I don't know what to call it. It's like a toolbox of devices and assistive technology that are related to sexuality, and we can teach about that as well. But really, like we do a lot of different things. We also do some research. We're working on two research projects mainly about like healing. One is about healing and trauma from sexual assault, and then the other one is about accessing healthcare for people with developmental disabilities who are LGBTQ plus. So it's a lot of different things going around at the IOD all the time. But we at the Healthy Sexuality Project like to just jump into things, and we get requests all the time to do technical assistance or just to answer some questions, sexuality questions. I'm happy to answer pretty much any of them. Um, and yeah, I'm not sure what else to say about the IOD, but
Mhm.
come visit us on campus.
Definitely. It's awesome. You all sound like you do so much. It's awesome. So next question. We know that many students who come to Temple have mixed experiences with sex education and access to sexual health care. Can you talk a little bit about why it's important for college students, including students with disabilities, to receive comprehensive sex education?
Yes, such a good question. Such a big question that I'll try to answer in like a few minutes. Um, Really, everyone benefits from sexuality education. Everyone does. And I know that we get lots of different kinds of sexuality education in this country. Anyone who comes to me, I usually ask like, well, where did you learn about this information from? And I'll get all different kinds of answers, like from friends or from media, or they did have a sexual health class in school, and that's awesome. I'd love to hear that. Or like my experience in sex ed as a young person was like looking at scary photos of genitals that have STIs, and like that was my education. And I knew that was not right at the time. I knew that was not right. It just didn't, it wasn't teaching me anything other than just like fear. And we know that people are going to make choices about their sexuality, regardless of if they know about the consequences or not. But that's why education is so important for everybody. It's really like sexuality is a natural part of life. Everyone, to some degree, has some sort of sexuality. It can be the lack of sexuality too. That's fine. But really, we kind of want to just accept that. But that is a part of life. We need to talk about it. It's different for different generations, but really for college students, super important because you're going to college, you're going into this new environment for the first time, you're navigating friendships, relationships, all of the work that you're doing for academia and all of like extracurriculars, and you're navigating a lot. And that can be really like stressful sometimes. So it's good to like learn about some more communication skills. That can be a part of sex education, or just how to build a healthy relationship. What do you look for in a healthy relationship? We don't always get a chance to think about that in high school or before. Um, and like people with disabilities often get very little sex ed, even less than everyone else. So often, um, we can talk about that a little bit more later, but uh, most people in the US don't really receive a lot of sexuality education. So coming into college, gaining that awareness and knowledge, um, what was I going to say? Da, da, da. Oh, statistics, right. I wanted to say um, disabled students receive statistically less sex ed and health info, even just like regular health info, at less than like a 50% rate compared to the main population or non-disabled population, which is like wild to me. But I don't know. I want like comprehensive sex ed across the country, and that's a whole other thing. But really, what sex ed is supposed to do is help us make informed decisions about our bodies, about our lives, and our relationships. And like, it also should include conversations around pleasure, conversations around safety. There's a lot that goes into it. It's not just like about sexual health. So I think, yeah, I think a lot of times maybe we get that sexual health information in high school, but we don't synthesize it further. Or like we just get the scary pictures and then we don't really know what we're learning. So yeah, sex ed is so important. And
Mhm.
it's, yeah, I could go on and on and on about that.
I get it. I get it. And it continues throughout life. Like it doesn't just end.
Hmm. Exactly. Yes.
You're
Lifelong.
80 years old and it's still like a part of your
Yep.
life. Um,
Absolutely.
so it doesn't just end. So I totally get that. So we're having this conversation during Cervical Health Awareness Month. So how might individuals with disabilities face unique challenges when it comes to cervical health, and accessing sexual health care in general? And then how can these challenges be addressed?
Another very big question. Um, so I did some digging about this myself, and I've been doing interviews with providers um, due to my other research projects. So I hear a lot of really interesting things. But the main issue is like the access to care. It's people with IDD are significantly less likely to receive any kind of screening for cancer or pelvic exams. Pelvic exams are so statistically less for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And even though people with developmental disabilities are at higher risk of sexual violence experiences or assault, but they receive the least amount of gynecological care. Um, so I found that at the National Institute of Health, and it just made me so mad because I'm like, these. Anyway, but I'll get into it. The doctors shared some more specific things with me about barriers and the lack of access. And we see like just exam rooms are traumatic. They're traumatizing to people. Just the way that they're set up. Waiting rooms too are just hard to be in. For I feel like for anyone,
Mhm.
it's a stressful experience. So like having thinking creatively about what the medical doctor patient like relationship can look like,
Mhm.
and you have to be creative and just think around different things. So like they're in doctors' offices. Surprisingly, a lot of it is not accessible for people with uh in wheelchairs, and there's inaccessible medical tables. So like if someone wants needs to get a pap smear, sometimes they'll try to just do it in their wheelchair, and it might not get the best um cells. It might not get the best like test because of that. Let's see. I've heard of different things like let's see, doctors just not asking about sexual health or like anything about it for
Mhm.
people with developmental disabilities. Um, and really, they can be addressed through a lot of training and a lot of outreach, I think, to medical professionals just to say, like, people with disabilities are a cultural identity. They're also people who might have symptoms or communication differences, and you're going to have to deal with it because you're a doctor and that's your job. But I think a lot of doctors sort of look at people with disabilities like they might not be able to fix the problem with this person. I've heard that in interviews. Um, or they won't take on a patient because they are like, oh, I don't know how this patient communicates. I don't really want to work with this patient. So there's a lot of like stigma. There's a lot of stigma in the healthcare setting around cervical care for people with developmental disabilities. Um, yeah, I have like a lot of access ideas that I think would be really cool
Mhm.
to include. I can kind of like segue into the next section
Sure.
because it kind of goes with everything. Um, but yeah, the lack of screening questions for people with disabilities and like in a gynecologist's office, a doctor might not feel comfortable actually asking these questions of somebody with a developmental disability, but you should do it because if they're adults and they're experiencing life, that is super important. Um, some doctors I've heard think that people with disabilities can't understand their pain or their conditions and can't act like speak about it to them. So they'll talk to the person who's like supporting the person with a disability in the room instead of the person with a disability. So like things like that, just acknowledging that there's a person there Um, and like going, well, am I meeting all of the medical needs of this person? You might have to ask additional questions. Um, let's see, what was it? Oh, some doctors may avoid giving um, the HPV vaccine, but however, in most state institutions, they will give the HPV shot to all residents, regardless of consent. So that's something that like I feel a little bit mixed about because like I always want people to consent to their medical care, but if it's necessary in a state institution like that, I understand. Um, but I really think like doctors just sort of they want like not that they want an easy solution, but they want to be able to be like, okay, here's this person, like we'll get them on their way and they can just go. But sometimes you need to spend more time with people. You need to help educate them about their bodies and what they are experiencing. Because sex ed is really bad for people with disabilities. So we want to, you might have to do some of that educating as a doctor. I'm like talking to future doctors, any future doctors watching, ask disabled people screening questions about their sexuality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely building up that care and that like community of people and not just like sending them on their way or not asking the right questions or any
Mm-hmm.
questions. Super important. We kind of went over the misconceptions and like the stigma. I don't know if you want to add any more to this part, but what are some misconceptions that people might have about cervical health for individuals with physical or intellectual disabilities? If you have any more. So,
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, like again, like the doctor just assuming that people with disabilities have no sexuality, wouldn't need these particular like treatments or examinations, but they do. It's a body like any other body, and it needs medical care. But I also wanted to add that we need to kind of like beyond the cervical health part of things, we need to acknowledge that disabled people can also be LGBTQIA plus. So not to like assume who people are having sex with. You should definitely ask those screening questions.
Mhm.
Um, there's just so many misconceptions though. There's misconceptions that like um, that people with disabilities wouldn't be able to learn about their own bodies and wouldn't be able to know about their own anatomy. And I've heard parents say that they don't want to teach their daughters or their people with uteruses about periods. And that's really damaging because someone, for instance, like there's somebody I worked with who was a young person in Delaware and they got their period one day and they had Down syndrome. They had no idea like what was going on. Yell like was screaming out in the bathroom saying like, oh my God, I don't know what's going on. There's blood everywhere and I don't know what to do. And then had to explain like this is your period. This is normal and natural. Usually when we see blood, we might think that it's like something bad, but in this case, it's normal. So it's like we have to do that education so we're not people are getting traumatized by their own bodies and have that information to take care of themselves.
Definitely, and not causing further like harm to
Mm-hmm.
someone. Definitely. So another, well, I have a bunch of questions, but for students who may not have received sufficient education around healthy sexuality, how can they start learning about cervical health and other sexual health topics?
That's another wonderful
Really
question.
interesting.
Um I always I don't always recommend Planned Parenthood, but Planned Parenthood is great and they have a lot of different resources. I would highly suggest checking out if you really want to get into it, Sex Ed to Go.
Mhm.
That is like a curriculum that's free. It's available to anyone who wants to use it. They have a teacher version and then a student version, and it's also in Spanish, so that's really cool. And they teach all about all kinds of things: healthy relationships, anatomy, sexual health, how to talk to a doctor about STIs, beyond all kinds of things. So that's a good place to really start if you're like, I don't know what to do or where to go about this information. And then I looked on the Wellness Resource Center website
Mm.
and I saw that there are like sexuality related resources there.
Mhm.
And all of those I would say are great. And you should go check those out too. Um, they're all like really accessible and I think free resources as well.
Awesome. Adding on to the accessibility part, how can sex education programs be universally accessible?
Yeah. So we always try to design things as accessibly as possible, but we also respect that we are not going to be able to make things accessible for everyone all the time. So we have to kind of you have to be creative again, being creative and trying to work with the people that you know that you're working with and not trying to generalize. So for people with disabilities, it might be good to work with them one on one to do better sex ed because they can ask all their questions. No one's interrupting them. No one's like distracting. It's just you and the learner. And that can be like a really good way to teach sex ed for people with disabilities. Also, just people in general, anyone. I would recommend. I would love for all like uh, what was I going to say? I lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. What was it? My educator brain is like, okay, break concepts down into chunks. That's a
Mhm.
really important part of making information accessible. Because
Mhm.
sometimes, like in the non disabled space, we want to just throw all the information at somebody and be like, here you go, take this, goodbye. But for people with disabilities, it might be here's some information. Let's work with it in a real world kind of situation
Mhm.
and then come back to more information. Or it just might not look as linear.
Mhm.
Um, and then like turning things into games, like gamifying things. We know that makes things fun, and then people are more inclined to learn when they're in like a good mood and they feel good. And then like visuals, lots and lots of visual examples. Uh, we don't need to use like scary pictures of genitals. We can use good, fun, um, images like from Planned Parenthood. They have like the fries model for consent. There's so many like different resources, but all I say is they can be accessible for people with disabilities. Sex education programs can be accessible. It does require some creativity. It might require having like different groups or even having parents around while you're doing the educating too. So it just kind of depends. But yeah, I don't know
Yeah,
what I was going to say about that.
yeah, definitely not a linear, like straightforward path. It's like a journey that
Exactly. Everyone's on their own sexuality education journey.
in what ways can sexual health appointments be more accessible, comfortable, and affirming for people with disabilities? We kind of touched on this with like appointment rooms and waiting rooms, things like that, but if you have any more to add?
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, this was like one of my longest answers to the question. But yeah, we talked about how like communication from doctor to patient is really important and
Mhm.
not to ignore the person with a disability in the room because it's
Mhm.
their health that you're talking about. Um, and then I talked about waiting rooms a little bit, how waiting rooms are really not good for anyone sensorily, but having like an option for people with disabilities to sit in their car while waiting or to sit somewhere else and they can get like a text thing when they need to go.
Yeah.
Just like things like that, like incorporating technology into the experience.
Mhm.
Adjustable exam tables move up and down like lower and higher than you would think an
Mhm.
average exam table would go. Um, Also, like informed consent, like choice to leave on some clothes during certain examinations,
Mhm.
or choice to have like certain people present for an examination if you need like a support person. Uh, just like being aware that the medical space for people with disabilities can be very fraught and difficult to navigate. So having that like open communication, and if someone can tell you what their accessibility needs are before they come in, even better. If you can have that like near their chart, great, because that's really going to help make it more accessible. And I think just like friendly providers, people you want to come see multiple times. I always like, I think I wrote like patient provider communication like 5 times in here because that's really the biggest thing I think is like we're missing that. We're missing that part. And there's so many misconceptions and assumptions about screening. So, yes.
Thank you for all this. I talked with a uh, trauma informed nurse provider, and she was talking about other ideas about having like music and like knowing your rights, like things like that, like things that you can do before the appointment, and making that clear, not just before, like not just like when you get in the room, but like before you do, so you can prepare and maybe have like a list and things like that and welcome, oh, like let's bring the list out and see these things and be excited about like helping patients. So these
Yeah,
things. Mhm.
exactly. Oh, and I forgot to say representation of people with
Oh,
disabilities
yeah.
in your offices or like just posters or in the pamphlets. You know, people like to see each other. They like to see themselves represented.
Um, so with cervical health in particular, PAP exams can bring up a lot of feelings for folks. How can patients and medical professionals work to make this experience more accessible, trauma informed, and comfortable?
So something we've been talking about in our research project is that good accessibility is trauma informed because it is creating an environment for someone to be successful in whatever way that looks for them. Um, I think just acknowledging that, like, the feelings about what am I trying to say? Acknowledging that these types of examinations, especially for like doing a PAP exam, are very invasive. They just are. Um, and just kind of like acknowledging that this is part of taking care of your body and knowing that it's okay. Um, but it might be scary, and that's normal. It's normal to be scared about this stuff. I think if you want to have, sorry, lost my train of thought. Oh yes, yeah. So you talked about like the music. I think having fidget toys for someone to hold on to while they're getting examined
Mhm.
would be lovely. Or even just like some people want to tune out and they don't want to be like so involved in the process. They just want their pap smear and but they might want to like look at something while they're laying down. They might want to look at like a cool poster or I don't know, a tablet. There's just the options are limitless for this. Um yeah, but I think just acknowledging that like this is it isn't going to be a stranger looking at your most intimate parts, and that's part of healthcare.
Mhm.
And it can be better. It will feel better over time, especially if
Mhm.
somebody like just goes for the first time. It could be so scary. I remember my first time getting a pap smear. Oh my god, I was like, oh my god, someone's gonna look at me down there. Oh my god. But I'm glad I did it because it's part of like preventing um HPV, and that's really important. And like, uh, yeah, sorry,
Definitely no.
my train of thought at the end of the day is like, whoa.
So much information, but it's really great information. But yeah, it can be definitely overwhelming.
Yeah.
I have three more questions, but how can college campuses work to create a more inclusive environment for students with disabilities when it comes to discussions around sexual health? And I know that you're doing a lot of work with this.
Yeah. I think having a sexual health program or project or sexuality education program is great. And having like sexuality educators who can be have like office hours, maybe teach some informal kind of classes, just like normalizing the conversation, not kind of like we don't want to separate it out from all of these other parts of life because it it is a huge part of
Circle
life is sexual health.
together.
So we don't want to separate it.
Mhm.
We got to normalize the conversation. We got to have fun sexuality educators who can plan events and get people to like talking about it. And just knowing that like nothing bad's going to happen if you talk about it like in a nice safe environment.
Mhm.
So yeah, and I think just having more resources available, more places to go grab condoms, more places to go and just like learn. And if you just want to ask a question, you could just go ask a question. I think it's
Mhm.
like the more freeing, just being creative about what that program could look like.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. And just having fun with it, honestly, talking about pleasure, talking about pleasure around safety, because I think
Mhm.
those two things are like intertwined.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think there's just a lot of ways to make it more inclusive and
Mhm.
um yeah.
Yeah, I love that you're talking a lot about creativity and like all the cool things that could be done, like all these amazing things that could be done and are being done. Um, are there any, you talked about a couple resources, but are there any more resources that you'd like to recommend for healthcare or education to learn more about what we discussed today?
So many resources. The ARC has a really good resource for it's called Healthy Understanding of Our Bodies, and it's for people with developmental disabilities. It's sexual health, sexuality. It goes into relationships, communication, and all that too.
Mhm.
I also have linked a pelvic exam social story, which is something. That's something I forgot to talk about. Social stories can make the examination more accessible if someone can see like what the steps are going to be,
Mhm.
just in like a simple pamphlet. Like
Mhm.
just like here's what the doctor's going to ask you. They're going to ask you to take off your clothes, and this is what you can do, and like it goes through it step by step.
Mhm.
And that can really help people feel more comfortable in
Yeah.
those kinds of situations.
Awesome.
There's just so many different resources. There's Planned Parenthood. I always say Planned Parenthood's great. Um, yeah, I think the list that we provided would be excellent.
Mhm. Awesome. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to this discussion before we conclude? Any final message?
Uh, Thank you for having me. I really
Sure.
appreciate it. I think people with disabilities are sexual. They're sexual beings like everyone else. So just acknowledging that it's real. It's here. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it.
Thank you so much for joining us today in this important conversation. We hope that students leave this discussion video with some new things, new ideas, new resources on how to support and advocate with students with disability, or if they're a student themselves with a disability. If you or a friend needs support, please reach out to us. We are always happy to assist students, talk with them, and just promote wellness on campus and beyond. And with that, be well to you. Thank you for joining. Thanks, Izzy.
Thank you.